The other day, we talked about how Nancy Pelosi has come out for Simpson Bowles. That letter written by those two old opponents of Social Security, which would call for a raft of new revenues in terms of taxes, but also deep cuts into Social Security. And I think Cliff and I discussed this on Friday. Also talked about Progressives United, Russ Feingold's organization, coming out and slamming Representative Pelosi for ostensibly signing on to cuts in Social Security. Well, listener Shade, I don't know, from Fargo, writes, I heard you talking about Nancy Pelosi's huge sellout by backing the Simpson-Bowles plan, but I think you have it wrong. Her endorsement is the kiss of death as far as any Republican representative is concerned. They'll vote against her beliefs as long as they aren't on her side and other Democrats. Republicans look like they're going against her by voting against it. She knows this garbage won't pass the Senate. It's just more political judo. I love your show, Sam. Interesting theory, and we'll ask Josh Horton about it in a moment, but there may be some truth to it. But be that as it may, it still essentially moves the center of the debate, or I guess the left margin, theoretically, of the debate, firmly entrenched on the side of cutting the most successful program this country has probably ever developed.
Scissors. Stop! Cut!
But it keeps 2/3 of our elderly out of poverty. It cannot, by law, contribute $1 to the deficit. It is the only thing that we can count on over the next 20-some-odd years. And even with projections of incredibly anemic growth in this country, growth that if those projections come true, understand is essentially a long-term recession, a long-term mild depression. Even on those very stark projections, it will still pay out slightly over 75% of the benefits promised today. 22 years out, it will start, as opposed to 100% prior to that time. And even under 75% of those projections, it would still be more than it's paying today because the cost of living increases. And this is with the full knowledge that we are taking in terms of revenue, statistically about 7% less than traditionally because of the tremendous amount of income disparity in this country. So to concede this point, even if it's done for some type of political expediency, I'm not sure of the value of that. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report. On the phone, Eyal Press. He is a reporter who contributes to The Nation, New York Times Review of Books, and has recently authored Beautiful Souls, Saying No, Breaking Ranks, and Heeding the Voice of Conscience in Dark Times. Welcome to the program, Eyal.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me on.
A fascinating book. You interviewed, interviewed is I think, a bit of an understatement. You profile 4 people in your book who all had sort of very unique circumstances in which, how would you describe what they did? Bucked well, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, basically they're nonconformists. They're people who say no in, as you say, 4 different circumstances, ranging from, I think, a pretty familiar case, familiar in the sense that there's a lot been written about. I start with a man who disobeyed orders when the lives of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany were at stake. That's the more familiar case just because there's a whole literature around how so many people conformed in that era and how that sort of greased the wheels for the Holocaust to happen. But I then move forward in time and in a sense closer to home, and by the end of the book I'm writing about a broker in the United States who says no to greed and apathy and refuses to go along with selling a product she thinks is being misleadingly advertised. And she ends up blowing the whistle on a huge financial fraud. That was the fraud at Stanford Financial in Texas. So the book is kind of trying to take this notion of resistance or refusing from the inside and bring it, from very extreme situations to the more prosaic situations that come up in our own lives.
And you also spoke to a man who, a Serbian who was saving Croats from being massacred during the 90s in the wars that in the former Yugoslavia, and
right.
And also an Israeli soldier who essentially decided that he was not going to patrol the Palestinian occupied territories.
Correct.
Tell us about that story.
The Israeli.
Yes.
Sure. There's a soldier I profile in the book named Avner Wishnitzer, and he grew up on a kibbutz in a very patriotic family and context. He was a little bit weak, skinny guy in his teenage years, and feared that he would not be able to serve in the army in the way that he kind of dreamed of serving to defend his country. But he develops a hobby. He becomes a taekwondo black belt and builds his sort of physical strength and ends up landing in the most select unit of all in the Israeli army called Sayeret Matkal, which is kind of like the Delta Force here, I guess. And he served in that unit for 3.5 years. And then when he got out of the army, he was still on reserve duty. His sister invited him to a lecture. And at the lecture, he saw slides of Palestinians in an area of the West Bank who were having their land burned, trees cut down, all kinds of harassment from Jewish settlers. And this guy, Avner, he really didn't serve much in the West Bank, in fact, at all, because he was in this very elite unit. They weren't sort of doing the day-to-day patrolling that goes on in the West Bank. But he was so disturbed by what he saw in these slides that he decided he had to go there himself. And he goes with some activists. He actually felt very uncomfortable because he wasn't an activist himself. He thought of himself as a soldier.
Felt that emptiness inside, to which he just could not relate, brought on by a simple twist of fate. He hears the ticking of the clocks.
In fact, this is where the title of the book comes from.
That's right.
But go ahead, tell the story, and then we'll get to that part, because that to me is fascinating.
Yeah, you're right. It does come from that. But basically, he's very uncomfortable, and at a certain point, the convoy so the convoy he's in is bringing blankets to Palestinians living in this area, and at a certain point they come to a part of the road where settlers and then Israeli police have blocked it, and they say you can't go forward. And Avner, being this sort of law-abiding soldier, thinks, well, we should turn around. We shouldn't break the law here. But the activists sort of push on and do go through. And in Avner's mind, of course, he's also thinking, wait a minute, why are we not allowed to bring people blankets? Why is that against the law? So it's the first kind of glimmer of doubt. And he goes there and for the first time in his life speaks to Palestinians, and then gradually has an awakening and decides that that what the army is defending in the West Bank is not Israel's security, but a system that he feels is fundamentally unjust and undemocratic. And if you want, I can explain that the title of the book indeed
Please.
does come from. Yeah, so Avner, on another trip to the West Bank, he goes to a village where he's heard that hundreds of olive trees have been just cut down and destroyed by settlers who do this because they can get away with it, because they want the Palestinians living there to leave so that the land will be free for Jewish settlers only. Well, Avner goes to this area of the West Bank, and once again,
and we should just say, we should just contextualize, olive trees are it's the significance of olive trees in that in those towns is more than I think we might anticipate or expect in this country.
It's the source of livelihood for farmers, for Palestinian farmers living in the West Bank. It's also of enormous meaning to people, and actually Avner very much understood that because he grew up on a kibbutz, and their main source of income was agriculture. So he spent his childhood, if he wasn't in school, he was gathering oranges in the orange groves or pruning trees, and so he very much understood why this was not a small matter. So he goes to this area of the West Bank, and he's not. And once again, there are Israeli soldiers blocking access, saying you cannot enter this. This is a closed military zone. And he goes up to one of the soldiers who's blocking him, and he's looking right at him, and he thinks, don't you realize I'm just like you. I'm just a soldier like you. But don't you see that something deeply wrong is going on here? I'm a soldier. I'm not some yafei nefesh. And that's the thought that goes through his head. And that's what he told me. And yafei nefesh in Hebrew is the phrase for beautiful souls. And when we hear that term, we think, well, why wouldn't you want to be called a beautiful soul? Well, in Israel, being called a yafei nefesh is kind of like being called a bleeding heart. Here, even worse than that. It connotes this kind of very naive person who never wants to get his hands dirty in the real world, and has this kind of puritanical, soft attitude. And Avner at first recoils from this term. I think today, he has a different view. He's become a refusenik. He doesn't. He will not serve in the territories. And I think he would say that he's come to terms with the idea that when you're faced with something wrong, it's not naive to let yourself see clearly that you shouldn't participate in it.
Listen here, say something that will make you nervous. Listen to me and go. They listen to me, and I'm the one that makes them famous. Someday you'll see and know it's another nice day for an angel disaster.
So that kind of tension that exists in his story plays out in all the other stories in the book as well.
And so what is it that brings these types of people together? Because when you write about the Serb, this was not a guy. This was not a guy who I think at first blush would appear to be someone who would do something heroic. I mean, not because they were sort of. And not in the sense that, well, this is a very quiet person. No, the guy just he seems like a guy who would be driving in from Jersey one night to party in New York City. I mean, what?
Well, you're right, and one of the to me, important things about the book is that, about the characters in the book, is that they are not saints. This is not a profile of 4 Mahatma Gandhis, and I think that that's important because I actually think my characters are more typical of people who take stands than the Gandhis. There aren't that many Gandhis or Martin Luther Kings out there, but there are a lot of people who have a basic sense of humanity and who are capable of displaying moral courage. Now, why does this guy, this Serb, why does that soldier, why do they do it? I sort of come away with 2 things. The first one is that in every story in the book, the characters end up defying the climate of opinion around them, which tells them that the person on the other side of that fence or on the other side of that wall or on the other side of that war is inhuman and is your enemy, and you have to fight them. You can't make room, you can't make space in your you can't extend empathy to them. And the characters in the book all defy that very bravely. They all sort of come to a moment, and often it's not because they had, the perfect education or ideology beforehand. It's often because they came face to face with the facts, with the reality. Avner goes to this place in the West Bank, and he doesn't see terrorists trying to blow up cafes. Which is what the Israeli media is full of stories like that every day. What he sees are farmers who are being harassed and mistreated, and he is fluent in Arabic, and he spoke to them, and that first experience sort of jarred everything loose. So one lesson in the book really is that it's much easier to be cruel and to accept those labels for the other when you're distant from them. And this is very much a lesson that applies, I think, here in America. We fight these distant wars against a faceless enemy, and I think that too often we don't come face to face with who it is who's on the receiving end of a drone or attack or whatever we may be speaking of. So in the book, the resistance is often sparked by these kind of face-to-face interactions.
What sparked Layla?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're saying the other point.
Well, the other point is that very often these people were not. They're almost radicals in spite of themselves, and they're not people who. They are all. One of them even says this about himself. They're all, in a sense, true believers. They really believe in the ideals of the system they've joined. In Avner's case, he really believes the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world, and he cannot square that claim and that principle with what he sees going on in the West Bank.
And I hope you are tired, and I know there is joy now, but I was asleep, and he woke me up again, and he woke me up again.
Does he continue to believe that? I mean, does he continue to believe that after that point, or is it that intersection when you have that cognitive dissonance? I'm part of the most moral outfit, or what I do is correct, and then I see just sort of evidence I can't ignore, and then it changes the whole worldview, or is it to bring that evidence, that problem, back into conformity with their prior version? In other words, which bends? Which breaks?
No, I think the worldview for Avner, the worldview broke. So I think every character in the book undergoes deep disillusionment because they are these true believers, and then they see something that is absolutely contrary to what they thought, and so they go through a sort of shock and a period of extreme disillusionment. But not all of them develop a whole new worldview. Avner does. He actually goes on to become one of the founders of a really amazing group called Combatants for Peace, which consists of Israelis and Palestinians, ex-fighters who have put their guns down and are trying to fight for a just solution. But you mentioned Layla Weidler, the whistleblower I portray. She doesn't, and I think often people don't go all the way in kind of letting go of everything they believed.
Well, in Layla Weidler's case, I mean, her firm was actually sort of actively engaged in almost explicit fraud, as opposed to someone who might be, let's say, an investment banker who was sort of engaged in the sort of less. I mean, in my opinion, it was explicit fraud, but this is what we do. We bundle a product and then we short it because we know it's junk. But caveat emptor.
Right.
I mean, I guess because we don't. I know we don't have too much time. I know you've got to get somewhere. But is it when we look at the lack of people in the highest echelons of our government who refuse to take a moral stand? For instance, when they find out, and I'm thinking guys like, Larry Wilkinson and Colin Powell, who, surely they must have known that if I take them at face value, that they were basically lied to as well before they made that presentation to the UN, which they now describe as the worst day of their careers or their lives. Surely they must have known at one point after that they had been lied to, and they could have resigned. Or surely there were guys on Wall Street who knew that they were selling junk. We've seen the proof of that. Surely we knew it with Enron. Is it possible that, when you talk about that, what is necessary for someone to actually stand up is to actually start with some type of idealism about their pursuit, as opposed to maybe the cynicism that is baked into a Colin Powell, to an investment banker who already says, like, yeah, I know, I entered into this profession knowing that it was, 1/8 corrupt.
Yep. No, I think you're right. I think that in Layla Weidler's case, she's not cynical. She doesn't go into the financial world cynical about it. She's an immigrant from El Salvador who makes her way through the system and lands a great job, or what she thought was a great job, as a broker. She's supporting 2 kids, and she has a completely idealized vision of American capitalism, one that I don't share, but that she believed right up to the day that she finally got a call from the SEC saying, hey, we want to talk to you about this former employer of yours named Stanford, and it turned out that everything she warned of in 2003, that they were engaging in fraud, turned out to be true, and they were indeed, it was a $7 billion Ponzi scheme by then. But I think you're right about two things about the Colin Powell example that are important. I want to make it very clear that, because the book is really about choice and people assuming moral responsibility. I think it's possible, it's more possible than we think, for individuals at all levels of institutions to do that. But of course, there is always a price to pay, and the price is greatest for those at the bottom of the hierarchy, the rank-and-file soldier, the low-ranking worker, the rookie on the team. Those with the prestigious titles and the good salaries and the plush positions have a lot more room to maneuver, and therefore they bear more responsibility. So I think that we should always have that in mind when we think about these kinds of moral dilemmas. At the same time, I do think that we are too quick to assume that there was only one thing one could have done, namely go along or fall silent. And that's simply not true, because in every case, if you look at, all the financial crises we're learning about and reading about now, there were people on the inside who spoke out. Too often, unfortunately, nobody listened to them.
Right. And, I just saw an interview last night with 3 former NSA agents who were all whistleblowers and now are subjected to just incredible attacks by the U.S. government. I mean, both sort of legal and, sort of FBI agents busting down their doors. And these are guys who clearly were, and they all have that profile of which you speak. They were incredibly idealistic about what their endeavor was, and so they held the standards to which the NSA was supposed to operate to the highest level.
Yeah. Well, I think that what is going on with them, and unfortunately often in the financial world as well, America has and Americans have almost a love-hate relationship to these people, I would say, to whistleblowers, to people who take principled stands. On the one hand, we romanticize them. They're kind of modern-day Thoreauvian characters who speak out and do something, the individual acting against the corrupt government institution or private institution, that plays very much to our deep belief, I think, in individual responsibility and so forth. On the other hand, when people actually do it, and power is threatened, and wealth is threatened, all too often they get persecuted or ostracized or fired, and so I hope that people who read my book try to think about why that make that love-hate a little more defensible and consistent by, if we really care and appreciate those who have the courage to stand up, we owe it to them to treat them better as a society.
I'm struck by the sort of establishment liberal response to Bradley Manning versus Daniel Ellsberg. And I focus only on the liberal establishment simply because I want to take that notion of the sort of the knee-jerk right response to anything that in some way encroaches upon our military. But, I think the same people who were, or at least today, lionize Daniel Ellsberg are very quick to say, Bradley Manning, maybe his treatment's been a little severe, but he should be locked up. How do you accomplish something like that?
Well, I think it fits the norm of what I learned in writing the book, unfortunately, which is that those who break ranks in whatever culture, even in democratic societies, it's easy to admire them from a distance after the fact. It's very difficult to even listen to them, much less admire them when they are right next to you in your workplace or in your government agency you happen to be working in, or in questioning the things that in a sense bind our society together. And so it's not surprising that there's no question that Ellsberg was not just a more controversial figure, I would say by many a hated figure, back in the 1970s, and that's because the issues relating to the Pentagon Papers and what was going on at the time were so many people were invested in that. Now today, very few people are. It's very easy to look back and say, oh yes, the Vietnam War, what a terrible misadventure that was. And no one's really very few reputations are on the line. But when you bring things up to date, and you talk about, torture, or you talk about the Iraq War, or you talk about various policies that have been implemented in recent years, look no further than Daniel Davis, the lieutenant colonel who has spoken out about Afghanistan and how the war is being fundamentally misrepresented. Well, then it becomes much less comfortable to listen to the message and to admire the messenger. So the easier thing to do is to say, well, this person must just be a rat or a traitor or whatever those common dismissive terms that we have for individuals who bring inconvenient truths to light.
Eyal Press, author of Beautiful Souls, Saying No to Breaking Ranks and Heeding the Voice of Conscience in Dark Times. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. We'll put a link up at majority.fm to your book, and love to have you back on to talk more about this. It's just a fascinating subject, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. Very much enjoyed it. Hope I can come back and talk about it more. Great. It'll stay in the news, that's for sure. Okay,
yeah,
take care.
Indeed.
Oh, kiss the world. Oh, kiss the sky. Oh, kiss my ass. Oh, let it rock. Oh, the April birds. And maybe, oh, baby, that's education.
Vermont, according to the AP, appears on the verge of enacting the nation's first statewide ban of fracking. Now, it doesn't appear that there's actually a lot of natural gas in Vermont, but it's and so there's obviously less pressure on their state legislators. In other words, they're not getting bought off as much as, let's say, they would if they were in Pennsylvania. But hopefully it is the first of many. On Friday, the Obama administration proposed a rule governing fracking that will, for the first time, writes the New York Times, require disclosure of the chemicals used in the process. Now, this is great because of a loophole in the Clean Water Act. I think they called it the Halliburton loophole, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm being serious. I think it's literally called the Halliburton loophole. Fracking companies were essentially not required to disclose what it was they were pumping into the ground. And so it's impossible for scientists and activists, or extremely hard, let's say, to determine if well water has been poisoned or aquifers have been poisoned, or if crops or reservoirs have been poisoned by the chemicals used in fracking, because there was no means in which to know whether or not the frackers were using this material. And so this law basically gives scientists and activists and anybody who wants to test to make sure that the groundwater hasn't been hopelessly polluted by these frackers the opportunity to know what has been pumped in there to see if it is now in the well water. Now, understand, this is the classic case of a corporation pulling this natural gas out of the ground. It's cheap. It's so cheap. We got a glut of it now, actually. It's so cheap. It's going to revolutionize our energy needs. It's going to help us get off of other carbon-based fuels and lead into the new century of other clean fuels. And it's very cheap. And, of course, the reason why it's so cheap is because they don't have to pay for the damage it does. This is an externality we all pay for. And then the problem with this regulation as proposed by the Obama administration, because it is in fact a total reversal. The original proposal would have required disclosure of these chemicals 30 days before a well is started. Why is this important? Because if you know that these frackers are going to come in and pump in benzene or trichlorozine or some other zine or whatever it is, the chemicals they're using. I've heard they're actually starting to use propane if you're aware that they're coming in and use this, you can go and test your water for these chemicals. You can't just take your water and send it to a laboratory and tell me every single chemical that's in the water. It would be too expansive.
Don't let her go wild. She says they won't believe you. You don't know what you're talking about. Doesn't sit still, doesn't look well. Give it something, make it chemical.
My wife works on some of these murder shows, and apparently when you get autopsied, what they don't look for is coolant fluid. But apparently this is a great way to kill somebody. You feed them small amounts of automobile coolant because it's sweet, and you put it in their pudding. And then their head explodes, or they have some type of aneurysm. And in the autopsy, they never see it because no one thinks to look for coolant. So the idea was, you tell us 30 days in advance what chemicals you're intending to use. We go out and we have our water tested, the aquifer, the reservoir, the streams, the wells. We have it tested for those chemicals. And then 30, 60, 90, 180, 360 days later, we go back and test for those same chemicals. And we have a before and after comparison. Well, now you will have no after comparison. Or no before comparison. So when you try and sue these companies, or when the EPA says, hey, you've tainted the groundwater for this city or this town for the next forever years. Well, the fracking company just says, it was there before. You just didn't test for it. I mean, that's the game that's being played here. And this is also coming on the heels of a story about the EPA fracking study that was done in Wyoming that showed fracking there was in fact tainting groundwater. It was contaminating it. And according to I guess it was HuffPo, Wyoming's governor persuaded the head of the EPA to postpone an announcement showing the link between fracking and groundwater contamination to give state officials time to debunk the finding before it was actually announced. This is according to an AP investigation, apparently. And in the meantime, the EPA actually gave a private briefing to those state officials. So you got to wonder who these state officials are working for. Are you done wondering? During the delay, state officials raised dozens of questions about the finding that the controversial procedure had become essential to unlocking oil and gas deposits in Wyoming, and beyond, they have tainted groundwater near the gas patch community of Pavilion. And this is all based upon emails, state emails, and an interview with the governor. This is just pretty stunning stuff. And it just gives you a sense of how easy it is to buy out a state if you're one of these companies. So the more you shrink government, essentially, the easier you make it to be victimized by these corporate interests who, what's a little bit of zine in your water? So it lights up. Think about all the value during a blackout. People never look on the good side of water pollution. It's always the bad side.
It's okay with me if you sit there and
You all know that author Jonah Goldberg. He writes for the National Review Online. He had some ridiculous book about liberals being like fascists. His mom was that woman who convinced Monica Lewinsky she taped Lucianne Goldberg. She taped all her conversations with Monica Lewinsky. Nice woman. Very sweet. Just wonderful. Wanted to help that kid out by destroying her life. Well, Jonah has the same measure of scruples and integrity as his mom. Of course, this is a guy who, fortunately for him, mom was a publisher, and so he is one of those bootstrap guys who managed to lift himself up through his mom's bootstraps. And it turns out it's not just lifting himself up through his mom's bootstraps. Bill Dedham, investigative reporter, writing on MSNBC.com, writes, on the dust jacket of his new book, The Tyranny of Cliches, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas, the best-selling conservative author and commentator Jonah Goldberg is described as having, quote, twice been nominated for Pulitzer Prize. You know how you become a best-selling author if you're right-wing? You have one of those organizations that your mom is involved with buy a bunch of books. And then they go to a warehouse and they get chopped up or they get given out at right-wing conferences. Pretty well documented. And then they become best-selling books. They get better placement in bookstores and sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Except for it's not self-fulfilling. It's because someone's actually buying them in bulk. Well, it turns out that Goldberg acknowledged on Tuesday, yesterday, that he has never been a Pulitzer nominee, but merely one of thousands of entrants. It turns out the bar to being an entrant is $50. Ooh. That's right, 50. So you need to pay $50 and then sign up to be an entrant. And I've got news for you folks. You're looking at a very soon-to-be Pulitzer Prize nominee multiple times over. I can assure you of that. Because I may not look like it, but I have multiple $50. When this bit of resume inflation was pointed out by a reporter for MSNBC.com, Goldberg said he hadn't meant to mislead anyone and removed the Pulitzer claim from his bio at the National Review Online. I never put it in the bio in the first place, he said. You know those writers, they never have time to write their own bios. That never happens. What's surprising in Goldberg's case is that he's been called out for the same resume padding before when his previous book was published. It turns out Goldberg had no recollection that people made us think of the fact that he had never been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. You see, it takes only $50 to get your name into a pool from which you are nominated, and then from the nominee pool, which is determined by the Pulitzer Prize nominating commission board, then you can win a prize. So in other words, I think Goldberg lied. That wouldn't be terribly surprising. There are only 3 nominees, known as nominated finalists, in each Pulitzer category. There are more than 2,000 entrants. If all Pulitzer entrants could be called nominees, any publisher could give all its authors that honorific by submitting an entry form and a check for $50. Oh, and in the event that he needed a publisher to do it, his mom, I believe, publisher of books. I don't know if she's still at Regent, but I imagine she still has her account. When Goldberg's liberal fascism came out in January 2008, his employer, National Review Online, announced that Tribune Media Services, which carries Goldberg's opinion columns, had nominated Goldberg for a Pulitzer in commentary. But it turns out that the Tribune doesn't nominate anybody. So Goldberg was aware that he shouldn't do this, but he said nothing. I know that's a shock, but Jonah Goldberg, I'm sure, very happy about this because this is probably the only publicity his book will get in the coming months. I know it's a cliche to say that guys like this are hacks, but I guess that's just the tyranny of cliches.
Well, alright. I know where I'll be tonight. Alright. Out of mind, out of sight. Out of mind, out of sight.
On Monday, there was a story broken by the AP of a foil plot. Al-Qaeda AP, which of course is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, was going to detonate a bomb on a U.S.-bound airliner. Sort of an updated version of the underwear bomb. The news service said it had learned of the plot sometime last week, but it was asked by the White House and the CIA to hold off. Ostensibly so that they could, the White House could launch, or the CIA could launch a drone strike on a guy named Fad al-Quzo. I may be mispronouncing that. Who was supposedly the director of external operations for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and was involved in this plot. Well, it turns out that the reason why the CIA and the White House wanted to hold off was that the bomber himself, the supposed suicide bomber, turned out to be a double agent. Was a Saudi Arabian agent who had infiltrated Al-Qaeda AQ, or AP, and was in fact never intending to carry out that plot, was simply a double agent. The CIA wanted to, or the Saudi intelligence agency wanted to make sure that person and their family was safe from any type of reprisals. Okay, so if you watched cable news for any period of time over the past 2 days, you would have seen this story being repeated over and over and over again. This plot could have killed hundreds of Americans. Now, I'm not minimizing the idea of an American plane being blown up. It would be obviously the worst thing in the world that could happen to me if any of my family members were on that plane. It would obviously be a horrific, it's obviously horrific. Innocent people being targeted, being killed by these so-called terrorists. But contrast that, Glenn Greenwald argues, to the complete absence of coverage on an outlet like CNN, or frankly, almost in any outlet, whether it's on television or not, to the fact that this past week, it was reported that up to 20 civilians were killed by 2 different NATO airstrikes. On Monday, at least one of those, at least 6 members, six people were The fact that 6 people were killed was conceded by the American military. We, and I mean all of us with our tax dollars, killed 6 members of a family in southwestern Afghanistan. The attack took place last Friday night. The victims were the family's mother and 5 of her children, 3 girls and 2 boys. Innocent civilians. It's not clear how these people were killed or why, ostensibly by a drone. And the easy answer for people is, well, that's more morally defensible than the idea of terrorists blowing up a plane because they're targeting civilians, whereas we just kill civilians incidentally.
Feel bad about the things we do along the way, but not really that bad. We inhaled the frozen air. Lord, send me a mechanic if I'm not beyond repair. He has fixed his sign in the sky. He has raised me from the pit, and he will set me high.
You know, by accident. Which is fine if it makes people feel better. But the fact of the matter, and Greenwald makes this point, that A, this happens over and over and over again. We have killed, certainly in Iraq, we know that our own government's estimates, we've killed over 100,000 innocent civilians. The number is probably closer to multiple of hundreds of thousands. In Afghanistan, surely we have killed thousands of innocent civilians. And Greenwald makes the point, at some point, and more than a decade would certainly qualify, the act of continuously killing innocent people, countless children, in the Muslim world most certainly does reflect upon and even alters the moral character of a country, especially its leaders. In other words, how many incidental killings can you as a country engage in without having it shake any of the moral righteousness that you had in that we don't target these civilians? Is there really, at one point, a fundamental difference between we don't target civilians, yet we know thousands are going to die over the course of 10 years, because that's just the nature of it? And can anyone say at what point the supposed reasons that we had for going into Afghanistan, even if you first thought them legitimate, are reasons for staying and engaging in the killing of these civilians, which we know will happen? And we have a standard in the U.S. courts. If you know that someone's going to die from your actions, even if that's not the point of your actions, you have legal and moral culpability and liability. So at what point do we hit that threshold?
I feel the pain of everyone. There I feel nothing. I feel the pain
never hear about it on the TV, but we never have to worry about that. And Greenwald makes an interesting point. There's a New York Times piece about U.S. confirming the Afghan airstrike mistake. That's the headline. The American military claimed responsibility and expressed regret for an airstrike that mistakenly killed 6 members of a family in South Afghanistan. Afghan and American military officials confirmed Monday. And then in that same article, they also mention 23 members of a wedding celebration drowned in severe flash flooding. As if, these things happen. There's really no difference between a family of 6 being killed by a U.S. drone strike and 23 people dying in a mudslide. It's just crap happens. What are you going to do? There's no difference. That's why they don't even put one of those little headings like in other news. No, it is the same news. To be an Afghani, to be killed by a drone strike is the same thing as being struck by lightning. To be killed as in a drone, to have your child killed by ammunition is the same thing as if a kid falls into a swimming pool and drowns. It's the same thing. It's just a hazard of life. It's all in the passive tense, the passive mood. There's no agent. There's no agency involved in being struck by a drone. Just like, swimming pool doesn't control what it does. It's just the cost of being born. And so we go day after day after day with really no recognition that we are killing people. And, I'm not someone who thinks that, I'm not a beautiful soul in that regard, in the way that Eyal Press was referring to. But it is stunning. It is stunning how we just are killing people without even having to process it. But the idea that some Americans could be killed? Whoa. Stop the presses. Stop the presses.
C'est une poupée.